What's going on, Grace? It's great to be with you this weekend, whatever campus you're joining us at. If you're watching online, we're glad you're with us. My name is Jake. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's genuinely good to be with you. And I hope you've had a good week. I hope it's been a good year so far for you. I hope if you're like a New Year's resolution person or a goals person going into this year, I hope you're still going, all right? We're like 3 or so weeks in. If you've stopped, if that's halted at all, stay on it, all right? Stay after whatever it is you were trying to get after this year. But we're glad you're here. And I hope you've been here the last handful of weeks as we've talked about some words that we think have the power to really change your life. And it's been a really impactful series for me as I've considered some of these words. And we started week 1 with the word thanks. And we said right off the bat, hey, this isn't pop psychology. This isn't like clickbait where we're saying, hey, read this article. And if you just read this, your life will change forever. Rather saying, if we think about the words that these are and the proclamation of them and the posture that our heart would have if we said them, can be a game changer for us. And so week 1, we talked about the word thanks. And we all agree being thankful is a good idea, but we also probably would say, hey, I don't know that I'm as thankful as I should be. And sometimes I think it, but I don't say it. And so we said, hey, how do we turn our emotion into expression? So we feel thankful, but how do we actually go and say, I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for what you've done. I'm thankful for how you've invested in my children. And we talked about how to even be thankful to God. Last week, we talked about the word wow. Wow. How there's so many things in our life, around us, and in our life that ultimately are amazing, that you would even say are amazing, but maybe it's familiarity or whatever it is, closeness, that the magnificent, and maybe even you'd say miraculous in your life has become mundane. And we said, hey, let's look for the awesome. Let's leverage this word wow to be reminded to look for the awesome. Look at all that God is doing, has done, and is doing in your life to celebrate and ultimately be able to say, wow, God, you're doing some amazing things. And so I hope these have been beneficial for you. But if you're new this week, glad you're here and you can just kind of hop right in with us. But if you have your notes, go ahead and grab them, flip it to the back. I want to give us a little bit of a refresher for some of what I just said about why we're doing this series. Here's the hope within all of what we're talking about in this conversation. Our hope is that it would start to really change our outlook through the power of words so that we can change our output. We can change our outlook through the power of words so that we can change our output. So that ultimately these words would be a means by which we think about, to some degree, how we're thinking about the world, how we're perceiving things. We're saying, hey, words have the power to kind of form our experiences and shape how we think and process. And so how do we just leverage these words as starting points to say, how can we change our outlook so our output can look differently? Our life can actually be better. And if we're Christians, we can be more godly. So week 1, thanks. Week 2, wow. And this week, I'll admit right off the bat, this word's gonna feel a little bit different than the last 2 weeks. In fact, if you think about thanks and wow for a second with me, usually what surrounds those things are positive things. So if you're saying wow or thanks in a non-sarcastic way, odds are those things around it are good. You're saying thanks because something was done that was kind, that was thoughtful, that was sensitive. Or you're saying wow because something's incredible, something's magnificent, something blew your mind, something was out of the ordinary. And so those words have around them things that are good for you. And this week it's a little bit different. In fact, the word we're going to talk about this weekend is a word that comes off the bench into the game, so to speak, usually when there's a problem, when there's an issue, when there was a mistake, when there was a miss or a miscommunication, when there was regret, when there was something that you wish you didn't say or didn't do. And so this word usually brings with it more complicated stuff than thanks or wow. And the word we're going to talk about this week is the word sorry. Sorry. And we believe that word has the power to change our life if we understand what's around it, what's within it, and ultimately are people who can say it. Even as I say that word, sorry, maybe what comes to your mind is like, man, I have some things in my life, man, I know I need to say sorry for. Maybe on the drive into church today, you guys argued in the car, and you're going, I should probably apologize for that after the message. Maybe you think about the person in your life that you work with that like, man, they never say sorry. And it drives you crazy. You're like, you're always blaming somebody else, but like, could you just own your part of the problem like one time? And so you're thinking about how annoying it is when people aren't willing to say sorry. I'm sure a lot of different things come in your mind when you just hear or think about the word sorry. But I want to, for a moment, just kind of hem our conversation in. And so here's what I want us to think about. Not maybe things that have happened to us that people didn't apologize for or what they did or didn't do. And if they did or didn't say, I'm sorry, what I want us to do is this, and make sure you hear this weekend, is I want us to just put a mirror up to ourselves and ask ourselves this question. Am I good at saying I'm sorry? Am I good at saying I'm sorry? And not only am I good at saying I'm sorry, am I good at meaning it? Is my posture in a right place to actually acknowledge when I was in the wrong, when I messed up, when I had an issue? I want us to put the mirror up this weekend. But I think we would all acknowledge that this word isn't easy. It's not always easy to say. In fact, it's not always something we're good at as a culture. Let me maybe give an illustration for a second that I think everybody will realize, hey, this isn't something we're good at collectively. So let's picture this. Let's say you have 3 young kids, all right? So let's pretend you're a parent. Some of you don't have to pretend on this one, all right? But let's pretend you have 3 young kids. Let's say they're like elementary school aged, all right? And you're sitting on the couch and you're sitting in a place where like the basement's right underneath you so you can kind of hear what's going on. Okay, and so you're on the couch and you're reading a book, you're watching a movie, and you're just kind of taking in your day. You're having a good time. And all of a sudden you hear it start to get loud in the basement a little bit. And you're like, should I go down and see what's going on? And you're like, no, they'll be all right. They're kids. And you just kind of let it go. And then it gets a little bit louder and you're like, I'm nervous, but I'll let it go. They can just play down there. And then all of a sudden you hear like a loud thud. And you're like, your parenting just goes off and you're like, all right, it's on. It's on. Something just went on down there. And so you get up, you go downstairs, and you open up the door, and you walk in, and you just see this massive hole in the drywall. And you see the 3 kids just looking at you in that moment. Now, let's picture this is how it played out, all right? Let's picture you did whatever mom or dad snarl or whatever kind of tone of voice you have in that moment to go, what just happened? And let's picture it played out this way. The youngest goes, before you can even say what, and before you can even finish saying what happened, he goes, you know what? It was my fault. I've been struggling to manage my emotions recently. I could do better with emotional intelligence, and I just, in the moment we were wrestling and it was like a 3 out of 10. It was playful and fun, but then she like did this thing and I got mad and I didn't control it, so it's my fault. And then Susie, the other kid, stops before the first kid can even end and goes, no. I know that about you, Billy. I know that about you, but I was doing things to provoke you, and so I know it was my shoulder that hit the wall, ultimately that caused the hole, and so Billy, it's not you, it's on me. And then Bobby in the corner goes, you know what? Stop, guys. As a 4th grade honors student, I should have put down my Nintendo Switch and I should have looked at you guys and I should have reminded you, hey, mom said don't play over there. And I should have reminded you of how grateful we should be, mom, that you got this house for us. Thank you, mom, that you got this house for us. And I already got on Amazon. I bought a drywall patch. We're going to take care of it, all right? We're going to take care of it. Here's the deal. That would be amazing. That would be amazing, but it's not what happens, right? You go down the stairs and that's going on and you know how the game goes. What happened? It's, well, he did this and I only did that because she said this and I did that. And so because of she and then I did, and then all of a sudden it's just finger pointing all around, and that's just how it goes down. And I wonder if for some of us, we're like, yeah, I know that plays out with elementary school kids. Maybe it's not going to be that way when I'm an adult, but you change from like the basement hypothetical in that scenario to like the boardroom. And here's what happens. We're still doing the same thing. We use some different words. Maybe in the basement, it's like, she was a poopy head, right? But then you get to the boardroom and it's some different words, but it's still the like, hey, what was up with that? Or it's on you, or I didn't, or why didn't you? And we're still doing this finger pointing thing. And it's true in the boardroom. It's true with kids. It's true in relationships. Here's how I'd put it in your notes, that just we live in a world of constant finger pointing. Constant finger pointing. When things go wrong, when there's an issue and it's like, what happened? Why did this play out this way? Our natural inclination so often is to point the finger and go, well, it was because of that. And even if we know like we were partly responsible, we just point the finger at what somebody else did. In fact, we see this, like if somebody were to approach you and say, hey, I heard what you said about me, and that was gossip. Why would you say that about me? Sometimes our response is, well, the only reason I said it is because I was at the table and at the lunch table and they were all talking and she started to say it and everybody was laughing. So I only said it because of what they said. And so we just point the finger. It's in the review season where you didn't hit the quarterly earnings. And your boss looks at you and says, hey, what went wrong? And your first inclination is to go, well, if it wasn't for the higher ups, they're always making us do these things, and I said it wasn't a good idea, and so it's ultimately because of management that we ended up here, and we want to point the finger, right? It's in marriage, where one spouse looks at the other and says, I can't believe you said that to me. And then the other spouse looks back and said, the only reason I said that to you is because what you said before and how you made me feel, and we're just awesome at this. And I don't think anybody wants to be awesome at it, but we're just awesome at it. And here's what I would say about finger pointing. It's really hard to put up the mirror if you're constantly pointing the finger. And so if you're constantly looking and going, hey, what they did or their part of it or what they should be responsible for, it's hard to just put up the mirror and go, hey, what was my end of this? What did I do? How did I contribute to this? How should I be quick to say, I'm sorry for whatever my part in this was? And let me just say this, like, I'm not trying to say in this conversation that every time something went wrong, it was 100% on you. I understand that other people do things and sometimes it was on them and it's a mixed bag. I understand all of that. My argument is not it's always your fault. Rather, it's to say what piece of the pie is yours and how can you own that? How can you be honest about that? How can you be quick to say, I'm sorry? So in a world of constant finger pointing, I think it produces something in us. I think our sin nature does this, and I think the world around us contributes to it. And there was a former pastor, leadership coach now who kind of created this language that I actually think is really helpful. So I think Christian or not here this weekend as you're engaging this, I think these 3 words and kind of the acronym of it can be really powerful for you to see what you do in moments where maybe you messed up or there was an issue. But here's what ends up happening. We become experts at BCD, of blaming, complaining, and defending. In a world of constant finger pointing, we become awesome at that. So if there's an issue, if there's a problem, if there's something that happened, we're just quick to go, well, and you start to blame. Or you complain about the situation and you just start complaining about things you can't control or other things or other factors, or you just defend yourself. In fact, I was thinking about this message and there's actually something I do that's spot on with blaming. And it's kind of a small thing, but it's funny. It's something my wife just gets so annoyed at me for reasonably. When I can't find something at the house that's mine, so let's say I don't know where a hat of mine is. My first question after looking for 3 seconds to her is, what did you do with my hat? And she's like, I didn't touch your hat. I never touch your hat. You always move your hat. And I'm like, you're right. And every time I'm like, why is it just in me to go, what did you do with my hat? Where she's like, I didn't do anything, but it's just in me to go, hey, did you or was it you? And why? Because we blame, complain, and defend. As we think about this idea of being able to say sorry, I think you can quickly see BCD isn't very conducive to being in a posture to say, hey, that was my bad. That was on me. I'm sorry that I did that. I'm sorry that I said that. And even if they have their part of the pie, if we're BCDing, it's really hard to get that. In fact, I put it in your notes this way, and I want us to just think about this for a second. But guys, there's a huge difference between BCD versus I'm sorry. When it comes to actual moments in our actual life where there's an issue, there's a problem, big or small, there's a huge difference between responding with BCD and I'm sorry. Huge difference. Sometimes when we kind of do this and give talks like this and in sermons, part of what we ask is why should people listen to this? What is compelling about this conversation that somebody would want to engage and hear what God has to say about it? And as I was thinking about this, I think this kind of point is why I hope while you're here this weekend, you'll listen in. Because this is so incredibly true. In fact, here's what I would guess is true for you. That maybe if there was a little less BCD and a little more I'm sorry, your first marriage would have been a lot different. I'm guessing if there was less BCD, more I'm sorry, that friendship that you loved wouldn't have fallen apart in that way. I'm guessing if there was less BCD and more I'm sorry, some of the things in your marriage you're struggling with right now wouldn't go away, but they'd be alleviated in a significant way. If you really think about the difference in these two and how it plays out over time, there's a huge difference. The way it affects our relationships, the way it affects our view of life, our output, our outlook. In fact, I would just say this, I'm guessing as you look at these two words, you want to be married to someone who says I'm sorry more than they BCD. I'm guessing you want your daughter to marry somebody who's quicker to say I'm sorry than BCD. I'm guessing you want your boss to be somebody who's quick to say I'm sorry rather than blame, complain, or defend. I'm guessing you want to work on a team or play on a team that's true of. And so if that's true that all of us acknowledge, man, it probably would be better if we were just better at saying sorry, then how do we look at the Word of God to go, what does it have to say to us about this? About being people who have a posture that leads to us saying sorry. So let's do this. Let's look at God's Word together and let's see what it has to say about this. So if you have a Bible with you, I would encourage you to go to the book of Luke, chapter 18. The book of Luke, chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible, we'd love to give you one before you leave here today. It's at Grace Central waiting for you on the way out on the right-hand side here at Pickerington, whatever campus you're at. You can find Grace Central and grab a Bible. We'd love for you to leave here with one. And we're going to look at a passage that might for a moment, as we read through it, not feel like it really connects to the idea of saying sorry. It's a passage about prayer in some ways. It's a passage partly about salvation, really, and how Jesus wants us to respond in general. But what I want us to really look at is the posture of the characters in this story. Because ultimately, earlier in Luke, we're not going to look at this, but in Luke 6, Jesus says, hey, when it comes to your words, those come from your heart. Out of the overflow of your heart, your mouth speaks. And so to some degree, if we want to fix our words, we got to go to the heart. And so this passage is all about the heart of these two people. So as we look at Luke chapter 18, let's really pay attention to the posture of these two people, all right? It starts with this. To some people who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. So it's to a group of people that are pretty prideful, right? To people who are like, I'm feeling pretty good. I have a decent life. I'm doing pretty well. I'm pretty moral. I'm in church. I say the right words and I don't say the bad words. Like, I'm pretty good. And so not only do they feel good about their own righteousness, but they're people who look down on others, which you may not do that all the time, but let's be honest, we have a way of doing that ourselves, of feeling like, man, I'm pretty good and I'm a little bit better than they are. And that manifests itself in moments where we even BCD rather than I'm sorry. So Jesus says, all right, guys, I want to tell you a story. Crisscross applesauce, all right, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Let's sit and let's listen. I want to tell you a story. And Jesus, as a master storyteller, starts to give this. Here's what he says. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So again, brilliant storyteller. Jesus goes, there's 2 people. The Pharisee, religious elite. Like, these were the people who memorized more of the Bible than probably all of us combined here at Grace. Like, they knew it through and through. There was so many parts of their life that was religiously connected. They were looked at as the people of authority. And so the person in this story you would think would spiritually get it right. And then you have the tax collector. And this is a person who couldn't have been more of an outcast in society, couldn't have been less respected, couldn't have been more viewed as just kind of the lowest of the low, as somebody who was just stealing and harming people in a lot of different ways in terms of how they're going about their job. And so these 2 people go to the temple to pray, all right? Here's what we see next. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you. It's not bad to start. So the Pharisee actually was here week 1 for words that could change your life. He's like, I heard thanks, so I said thanks. Like, I started my prayer to God. God, I thank you. It's funny, I was reading a commentary about this. In another translation, it translates it kind of more literal to the grammatical way that the Greek was set up. And it says the Pharisee basically was like praying to himself. And so the way the words are set up, it's a little bit different than even this translation reads. It's kind of like the Pharisee was so kind of into himself, he was praying to himself. But he starts all right to say, hey, God, I thank you. Here's where it goes a little bit awry, and we see into his heart that I am not like other people. Yikes. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I picture him in the story being like, come on, man. Like, come on. Why are you calling me out in this moment? But he goes, hey, I'm glad I'm not like them. And then he's like, here's what I do. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all I've got. Like, hey, I listened to the sermon when Keith was like, hey, go to church. It's good for you. Guess who's been at church? I've been at church. I've been there. And they're like, hey, I even saw the picture on Instagram. And they weren't at church. They were on a boat. I was at church, right? I go to church. I'm giving my money away. I'm fasting. I'm doing the religious stuff. And I'm not like them. So in essence, the prayer and the posture of the Pharisee's heart is kind of like, God, thank you for making me me. I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. If there was like a Time magazine spiritual person of the year, I'm in the running. I'm doing just fine. So God, thank you that I am me, that I'm getting it right. And you can almost picture like this person would never end up saying, I'm sorry. Like, they would never think they're wrong. They would never think they did it in a certain way where it was the mistake that was on their end, right? His posture was in a place of saying, I'm good. And let's also realize, hey, we do this in our own way, right? Like, there's moments where we feel like we're like better than somebody else. We all have these people, so let's not pretend like the Pharisee in the story is the only one, right? Like the people that this happens for me sometimes if I'm not careful, and we all have them too, all right? So don't judge me, is when I'm at like a restaurant, all right? And I hear the person at the table next to me getting like unnecessarily mad with the waiter or waitress because their food is wrong. Like I leave that going, I'm not a half bad person. Like I'm a little bit patient. I'm not as impatient as they are. And if I'm not careful, I can leave going, all right, I'm not as bad as they are. But that's what the Pharisee was doing in that moment. And that's what you and I can do. Well, I'm pretty smart. I'm not like they are. I'm pretty well off. I'm pretty grounded. I'm not like they are. So we see this posture to go, I'm doing all right. Let's see the difference we see. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven. Pharisee walks into the temple, walks into church, goes right up to the front, stands tall, starts to pray, all those things. This tax collector's like, I couldn't even get past the front door. I'm not even gonna like, in my physical posture, like look towards heaven. Man, what a difference in the disposition of these two people. And let me just aside for a moment. Some of you might be in the place where you feel like, man, it's hard for you to just get in the door of the church. Some of you might be watching online right now because you're like, I'm not even yet ready to show up to a space yet because I just feel, And just hear me say this weekend, God's glad you're here. God's glad that you're here. But this tax collector's going, man, I don't even want to look in that direction. I couldn't even get in the front door. He goes on to pray this, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me. I know I get it wrong. I know I missed the mark. I know that I am a sinner. So different than the Pharisee going, I'm doing just fine. I'm all right. I don't have really anything to apologize about. We see the tax collector going, man, I am a sinner in need of grace. Again, if we're thinking about the word sorry, you can picture him leaving this going, Lord, I'm sorry for being impatient. Lord, I'm sorry for saying that to that person. I'm sorry for missing the mark in that way. You can picture that coming out of his mouth because his heart is in a place of acknowledging he's not perfect. He doesn't always get it right. In fact, Jesus, I love how in the parable he says that he responds, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, the tax collector rather than the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. So Jesus going, forget who was religious out of the two of them. Who was the person who actually had a right view of their heart? Who actually acknowledged, hey, I'm in the wrong. Hey, I have some issues. Hey, I am a sinner. And so we see a vastly different posture in these two people. One person, I'm doing great. One person, I need grace. As we think about a word that will change our life and the word sorry, man, I hope I'm more like the tax collector. I hope I'm more like looking at God, not even wanting to look at God maybe, and saying, I'm sorry. Have grace with me. Have mercy on me, a sinner. And as I think about this and as we process this text together for a second, I want to put maybe a phrase in front of us and a call to action for us this weekend as we think about our heart, as we think about our posture, as we think about being more like the tax collector, because the Pharisee was quick to publicly pray about his virtues, but the tax collector was actually ready to admit his imperfections. And that's a part of what Jesus is saying he wants. He wants our humility. And so I want to encourage us through this text to this weekend as we think about our heart that leads us to being able to say, I'm sorry. We need to get good at this. We need to get good at normalizing, owning our imperfections. And let's get good at normalizing, owning our imperfections. And we are imperfect people. We're not going to get it right. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say things we wish we could take back. We're ultimately people who are sinful. And what would it look like if we just got used to owning that? To not blaming, complaining, defending, not pointing the finger, not going, well, if it wasn't for them, and if she didn't, if they didn't, if it wasn't, if I didn't miss all the traffic lights on the way in, like what if we just exchanged all of that for being quick to go, you know what? I have my own stuff I'm working through. I'm sorry for that. Again, not some self-deprecating, acting like all the time, woe is me, but a humility that goes, man, I am acutely aware of the ways that I fall short. I'm also acutely aware of the grace of God in those things. But man, as you normalize owning those things, it would lead you to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Imagine if this was the case in your marriage, for those married. If you just normalized owning your imperfections. in heated conversations and arguments and moments where there's blaming, complaining, defending. Imagine this was how your family was. Imagine parents, if you did this more, even with your kids, of going, hey, buddy, I'm sorry, I wasn't patient in that moment, and you owned that. Imagine this was more the culture of the team you're on at your business. But you normalized owning your imperfections. The tax collector was quick to say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, one who is imperfect, one who misses the mark. How can we do the same? So as we think about the idea of normalizing owning our imperfections, I want to give us 3 things that I think maybe add up to us being able to do that the text tells us. Things that we see in this story, this parable that Jesus told, that I think are powerful as we process the idea of normalizing owning our imperfections. Let's start with the first one. This one is huge, and I'll explain it. We need to compare, quote, up to God, not down to people. Compare up to God, not down to people. I'll explain this. One of the most powerful parts of this text, I think, is what the difference in what the 2 people processed in terms of how good they were or weren't. So think about it. Remember what the text said. The Pharisee was going, hey, I'm here and I'm not as bad as the people who are down here, right? They're going, hey, those people do some bad things. I don't do those bad things, so I'm pretty good. So he's comparing himself down to worse people. What does the tax collector do? He compares himself up to a perfect God. And so instead of going, well, I'm not as bad as that person. I'm not as messed up as my neighbor. I don't say that, or I don't do that. He's going, all right, I need to compare myself actually to a perfect God. And so it shapes the way he even processes his imperfections. You guys have, I'm sure, felt this before in some area of your life, but I felt recently the difference in how I feel about some things in my life based on who I talk to. I've talked to people at certain moments of my life where when I was in a season where I was eating well or getting up early or just having like discipline in my life and exercising and things like that, where I would talk to somebody who maybe they just had a lazy season of their life or something like that. And I left the conversation going, all right, I feel like I'm doing pretty good. I'm getting up pretty early. I'm drinking a decent amount of water. I feel like I'm exercising maybe the way that I should. And so I left that conversation going, all right, I'm not in that bad of a place. And then there's other times where I'll see things where, man, it's the total opposite. Where like I'll get on Twitter or something and I'll see a video of like, I think I've seen Mark Wahlberg post one like this, where he posts something at like 4:45 in the morning. He's like, I've been up for 3 hours already. It's like, I've drank 2 gallons of water. I've done a 45-minute workout. I've done meditation for about 30 minutes. I've read the whole Old Testament. It's like, come on, Mark. And like I leave one of those conversations like, I'm not doing half bad. I'm doing a little bit better than they are in this thing. But I look at the other one when I look at Mark or whoever that is and I go, man, I might as well be like on the couch eating chips all day. Like I am nothing compared to what that person is doing. There's power in how we compare ourselves to others or to something. And here's what I want to call us to do this weekend as we think about normalizing our imperfections, is to make sure we're comparing ourselves up to God. And what do I mean by that? This is why we talk about, man, get in your Bible. Come to church. Be in a group where they're going to talk about the things of God, because when you talk about the things of God, when you're in front of God, when you're praying to God, when you're reading about God, you're reminded of all of the things about God that if you're a Christian, you're trying to emulate. So you read stories about God's goodness and you're reminded, man, my God is so, so good. You know what that does to you in that moment? It reminds you, man, I'm supposed to be good to everyone around me too. You see stories of God's faithfulness and how he's never wavered to love you. And you celebrate that and you're reminded of that, and it reminds you as a little Christ, as a Christian, man, I'm supposed to be like him. I'm supposed to be like God, and so I'm supposed to be faithful. And so what happens is when we're not faithful or we're not patient or we're not good or we're not the things of God, again, we don't go, woe is me, but we say, man, I've missed the mark. I didn't love the way God would have wanted me to love in that circumstance. And it's easier for us to own it. It's easier for us to own it. And so I would ask you, how are you doing at staying in front of the person of God? How are you doing at learning more about who he is? How are you doing at prioritizing church? Where you're going to hear about these things of God that, again, as you try to follow him, you're trying to emulate. You might have heard this quote before, but it's important in this conversation about humility. Humility isn't humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So in this conversation, it's not you thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking of yourself less. It's focusing on the goodness and the power and the character of God. And so in humility, focusing on that, and being able to say, man, I'm going to own it when I don't hit the mark. I'm going to own it. Why? Because we compare up to God, not down to people. Second way we're going to get better at normalizing our imperfections is this. This one's huge. We've talked about this a little bit. Confess your part of the problem. Confess your part of the problem. So if you think about it, the tax collector said, hey, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So he's going, I have my own stuff. God, have mercy on me. And the Pharisee was going, hey, I'm not as bad as them or them or them. And so he was looking around, just pointing the finger. So how do we, in times where, okay, it's part me, it's part them. My wife did do that thing, but I also did a part of it. And okay, that person at work contributed to this, and we were on a team, and so it was a little bit of them. And how do we actually just own our part of the problem? One thing I've noticed in myself in this, and maybe this is true for you too, is that sometimes if I'm not careful, like I feel like I'm letting them win if I say sorry first. Like I almost want them to say sorry first, and then I'll say sorry. Like I make it this conditional thing where I'm like, well, I'll do it as long as you do it first, all right? And I make it like this weird kind of if-then reality. And I was thinking about this, and it's almost like, have you guys seen those Rube Goldberg, I think they're called, machines, where it's like this whole massive contraption where it's like, you've probably seen this in a movie before, where like the alarm clock hits a certain minute, and when it hits the certain minute, a ball goes down a ramp, and then the ball goes into this teacup that slowly goes over, and then dominoes fall down, and then when the dominoes fall down, they get to the bottom, and then it like builds a puzzle. And then when the puzzle is done, it takes a picture of the puzzle. And then like 8 other things happen. And then you're like on step 23 and it's still going. I think sometimes that's what happens with us when we try to say sorry, is we make it so complicated. And there's like so many things that have to happen in order for us to actually be able to say, I'm sorry. So you're like, well, it's got to be in order for me to actually say sorry to that person. Like it's got to be like a full moon, all right? It has to have been like a nice day. And it can't be like traffic in the morning because I'm going to have been frustrated. And they have to like have been nice for me to like the last 2 days at least, so we are in like a good spot, and then maybe I'll consider saying, I'm sorry. Right? Like we make it such a thing where so many things have to happen in order for us to just own our part. But man, if we normalized owning our own imperfections, we'd just be quick to do it regardless. We'd be quick to do it regardless. And here's something I want to just level with you for a second. We need to learn how to own our own imperfections and say, I'm sorry, even if they never do. And we need to say it in certain circumstances, knowing full and well they may never apologize for their part. And I'm not talking about the circumstances where it's like, man, an abusive relationship or they did all this stuff. I'm not talking about those, but in the normal kind of areas of life, own your part. And here's the deal, they may never own theirs. Maybe there was a situation with your son, and some things were said and some hurtful things were said from him to you. And you responded with emotion in that moment. And you're going, man, I don't want to apologize because he's not going to apologize to me, and you're just frustrated and you're hurt. How do you own your imperfections and say, I'm sorry, knowing he may never say he's sorry back to you? How do you say sorry to that friend when, man, they have their own stuff that you are really hurt by? And you can acknowledge that, you can still call that out, but how do you own your part? And here's where Christians, I think this gets really humbling for us. Imagine if Jesus, just think about this for a second. Imagine if Jesus treated sorry that way to us that we do to other people often. Here's what I mean. Imagine if like before he was willing to forgive us, he was like, all right, you got to all come together and collectively like own your part of it. So like before I'm going to go to the cross, everybody's got to kind of get together and say a collective, I'm sorry to me before I go to the cross. But what does the Bible tell us? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So how do we emulate that to go, man, we're going to own our own imperfections. We're going to own our part. Third thing is we think about having a posture of owning our own imperfections to be able to say, I'm sorry. Third thing I would say is this that we see from the story. Consider the forgiveness you already have. Consider the forgiveness you already have. And this one's huge. If you remember in the text, Jesus says about this parable, hey, one of these people left justified, left forgiven. It was the tax collector because of how he responded. And I just picture him the rest of the day, man, in moments where he messed up, where there was a mistake, being able to be quick to say, I'm sorry, because he's like, I'm justified. Like God's covered me. God's forgiven me. I'm accepted by the Most High King. I can have the courage maybe in a moment to say, I'm sorry. I remember a situation in college that discipled me, I'd say, in this reality, maybe more than anything I've ever been discipled in regards to this in my life. There was this leader in a college ministry that was leading myself and probably about a dozen other guys. And we would go over to his house every Monday night. And he was a guy probably in his mid-40s, had a couple of teenage kids, and had been doing this for a while, this college ministry. And he was leading and like teaching in front of hundreds of people, hundreds of college students. And he would lead our group, and so he was in a place of spiritual leadership. And we were talking about in this study over the course of a semester the idea of like our identity in God and who he is and how we can be a child of God and are that regardless of what goes on. And we were talking about that one night, and I remember him kind of going, hey, I want to do something different tonight than what we normally do. And we were towards the end of the study, and he started to tell us a story. He said, hey, I want to be honest with you guys about something. And what he did for the next probably 5 or 10 minutes was he actually confessed to us something that he did earlier that week. He said, hey, for the first time in a really long time, I found myself watching pornography. And he started to explain, he was up late and he was watching the show and a commercial came on and it started to tempt him. And normally he was able to kind of shut that down, but there was just a moment of weakness. And there was one device in the house that didn't have some protection on it or whatever it was. And so he went to that and he found himself watching that. And then he told us, I confessed it to my wife. And he said, I was embarrassed. And I didn't really know what to say, and I was ashamed, and I was just sad for what that kind of produced in her in that moment. And then he said, I went and confessed it to my staff team, and I told them, hey, I'm just sorry, I missed the mark, and I want to just say this to you. And he's like, then I felt compelled to say it to you all. And I'm this college student sitting there going, man, you're in like spiritual leadership, and why are you saying this? And I almost felt like he shouldn't be, but then I realized like how powerful it was that he was willing to confess that to us. And I was processing that, and then I remember him saying some version of this. I don't remember his exact words, but I remember this so vividly. He's like, man, I was embarrassed, I was ashamed. I felt guilty about it. But man, the thing I was able to stand on within my struggle, within my pain of that, within what it created, was that I am a child of God and I know Jesus has fully forgiven me for that already. And regardless of what I do, he loves me, he sees me, he's forgiven me. And he's like, there was real consequences and really things happened, but he's like, that's what gave me the courage ultimately to confess it. Here's what I'm trying to say. As we think about normalizing owning our imperfections, saying I'm sorry, I think it gets a lot easier if we're reminded of how we're already forgiven as Christians. If you are a Christian, Jesus has already forgiven you for everything you have done, will do, are doing. It's forgiven. He's paid for it on the cross. And so if you're sitting here and a part of what you're thinking is, I don't even know how to say sorry for that. I don't even know how to do this with my life. And you're like worried it's going to make you maybe insecure. It's going to chip away at some things. Like you are a son or daughter of God. It's not going to change. And something I find in me, and maybe it's true in you, that makes it hard to say I'm sorry in certain moments is it almost feels like, man, is God going to like love me less? It makes me insecure. And man, be reminded, God loves you. He's forgiven you. And have the courage to be able to say, I'm sorry. Why? Because you're a son or daughter of God. It's not going to change. So man, let's normalize owning our imperfections. Let's be people who don't just say thanks, don't just say wow, but in the right moment say, I'm sorry. I think there's maybe a starting point for this that all of us can do, and this is for Christians in the room, that I think there's a recipe maybe to get good at this in terms of saying sorry to others. Here's how I put it in your notes, that ultimately I think the better we are at saying sorry to God is the better we'll be at saying sorry to others. The better we are at saying sorry to God is the better we'll be at saying sorry to others. So the more we just get in a routine of owning our imperfections before the Lord, I think it'll actually help us in circumstances with other people. In fact, some of you may have learned how to pray this way. The idea of the ACTS prayer, ACTS, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. It's an encouraged part of our prayer to just say and confess things that you feel like you've missed the mark on, you've sinned on, again, in a humble way, not some self-deprecating way. So how do we get good at saying sorry to God so we'll even be good at saying that to others? Wanted to, as I thought about this time together, to end in maybe a unique way. It's something we do every once in a while here at Grace, and the Bible commands us to do, and we do it consistently, but on a certain schedule. And I want us to take communion together this weekend here at Grace. And as we think about this idea of owning our imperfections, we should look to Jesus. And ultimately, that's what happens in this parable where Jesus talks about this person being justified, this tax collector, because ultimately they took their heart and they said, have mercy on me, a sinner, and they directed that towards God to say, I know you are good and you are holy and I miss the mark, so have mercy on me. And so I want us to just consider for a moment as we think about being imperfect, as we think about some maybe things that we're due to say sorry for after church this weekend, as we think about some parts of our personality that maybe are conducive to those things that make us regret what we said or what we did, and all of that. We're reminded that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That God saw all of our imperfections. God saw our sin. God saw us running from him and said, I still love you and I want to draw you near to me. So what I want to do for a moment is this. I actually want to give you just like 30 seconds. And if you could bow your head and close your eyes, I want to encourage you for a moment as you think about the idea of saying sorry. If you're a Christian, I want to encourage you to really confess to God. What are some things that you just know are off in your heart, are off in your life, are off in that relationship, are off in that situation? And I want to give you just about 30 seconds and just talk to God. Just confess silently to him. Father, we are prone to wander. God, we so often are self-centered and selfish, and Lord, I confess that for myself, how often I put myself first. God, I confess the ways that I seek worldly things rather than eternal things. God, for this church this weekend, we just confess to you the ways we fall short. And God, at the same time, we worship you, we praise you, we celebrate you because you meet us in those things. You have grace for us in those things. That when we say, I'm sorry, when we repent, when we confess, Lord, you're faithful to forgive. That Jesus, you died on the cross to ultimately forgive our sins and that we're free in you. So Lord, as we take communion in a moment, would it be a physical reminder of what it took to forgive, to make whole, to redeem each of us? Pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.